So good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Marian Kornilowicz. I am a trustee of the Kosciuszko Foundation, and I am the moderator today. Welcome to the listeners to this webinar, which is part of a Studying Poland Today talk series presented jointly by the Kosciuszko Foundation and the Project on Poland Past and Present. This is an initiative started by Professor Norman Davies, which aims to raise the level of general and expert knowledge about Poland in foreign countries and to strengthen Polish studies at universities in the English-speaking world. So let me introduce our panelists. Paulina Duda is a distinguished academician with a focus on Polish studies and film. She's a translator and film critic and currently a visiting professor at Brown University. She received a Ph.D. from the University of Michigan, an M.A. from the University College in London, and a B.A. from the Jagiellonian University. Jaroslaw Garlinski, a highly regarded translator of books of Polish literature and history and author of numerous articles. He was born in London and grew up bilingual. His father was a noted historian and his mother an Anglo-Irish, who was one of the few British citizens who lived in Poland during World War II. Both parents served in the Polish underground during the war. Jarek was educated at the University of Nottingham, the University of Grenoble, and the University of London. He's fluent in many languages and had a distinguished career in education. He is a member of the Polish Institute of Arts and Sciences of America and has been decorated by the Polish Ministry of Defense and the Knights of Malta. Bozena McLees, a noted scholar and teacher of Polish language and studies, as well as a translator of poetry. She is very involved in promoting Polish language and culture and issues relating to them. She is currently a director and instructor at the Interdisciplinary Polish Studies program at Loyola University in Chicago. She's very active in Polonia. As I noted, I'm Marian Kornilowicz. I'm an attorney in Philadelphia, and I am a trustee of the Kosciuszko Foundation. For purposes here, I was born here. I grew up bilingual. I studied at Jagiellonian University for 1 year on a scholarship from the Kosciuszko Foundation. My father finished officer candidate school in 1939. He fought in the September campaign in North Africa and then in the Italian campaign. My mother grew up in what is Belarus. She was deported to the Soviet Union, transported to Iran, and lived in what was then Palestine till 1947. They met in London and they immigrated to America in the early 50s. Some general comments or notes about the presentation. There are 4 participants here. Each of us has had different life experiences and resulting perspectives and opinions. Each of us is sharing those personal experiences, perspective, and opinions with you and is not speaking in any representative capacity. For example, I do not pretend to be a representative of American Polonia, and I'm not speaking on behalf of my law firm, nor on behalf of the Kosciuszko Foundation. Our experiences, perspectives, and opinions differ among ourselves, and in many cases, they're going to be different than many of our listeners. The experiences, perspectives, and opinions of our listeners are no less valid than ours, even if they are different. As for technical issues, please direct all questions relating to the topic to the Q&A feature. And as far as any technological issues, please do that through the chat function. As noted in the various releases relating to the seminar, this seminar is going to touch issues that Poles living in Poland and elsewhere face on occasion. And as an initial issue, it includes what it means to be Polish or have a Polish identity. And the panel will share their thoughts with you on that. And I'm going to start with Jarek, and I'm going to ask the question, what makes us Polish or have a sense of identity? Jarek?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a privilege to be here. Polish identity is like identities of any other nation, I suspect, are hard specifically to pin down. But I think in our case, we need to look backwards a little bit, although I hope today we will spend a lot of time looking forward, actually. But I think one goes back to the Second World War, which I think seems to have had an enormous impact on Poles, both in Poland and those of us living around the world. And I thought I might take the liberty of just starting with and it's not really an anecdote, story about my late mother, who, as you learned, was not Polish. She went to Poland in 1935 for 2 months and stayed for 10 years. During those 10 years, she married my father on September the 4th, 1939 in Warsaw. They had a honeymoon of 20 minutes. My father left straight for the front. Later, she, as far as we know, is the only British woman in Poland throughout the whole war, and indeed in Warsaw. And she was there during the Powstania, and she in fact took part in the Powstania as a nurse, and she almost lost her life there. But anyway, in the spring of 1945, she was repatriated to the United Kingdom, and she met up again with her family and her friends, all of whom were immensely sympathetic, but could in no way relate to what she'd been through. My grandmother, my mother's mother, who'd spent the war living in the Republic of Ireland, absolutely could not remotely comprehend what my mother had been through. And that was, if I understand it, I wasn't around yet then, but that was a sense of frustration to my mother. Conversely, though, when she met Poles and she told them, byłam w powstaniu, brałam udział w powstaniu, people instantly knew what she meant, even though they themselves hadn't been there. Because in England after the war, many people from the Drugi Korpus, many of whom possibly had never actually even been to Warsaw in their lives, because they'd come from the Kresy. But anyway, that shared experience, even if vicariously, of the Powstania, bridged gaps. And I think, Paulina, I'm right, I'm saying that also resonates today with a younger generation in Poland. Is that correct?
Yeah, Jarek, I must say that when I heard your story for the first time, I was truly, truly envious of that biography, thinking how, no matter how tragic, traumatic it is, but that made me think that it is precisely because Poles do like thinking about themselves in this like more traumatic ways. And when you talk about traumatic on the one hand, but on the other hand, anybody who hears about the Warsaw Uprising thinks about heroes. So it's also the heroic perspective. And I would say that especially with the topic of Warsaw Uprising is something that would nevertheless resonate with the younger generation right now. There has been efforts to really keep up this memory in cinema arts. There was a famous Polish super production directed by Komasa, Warsaw 44, that in a more Hollywood style tries to recapture the events and experiences of the Warsaw Uprising, and actually to promote it outside the Polish world, which it was fairly successful. Not so much popular with Polish critics who would rather see more serious, more gloomy and grim view of the Warsaw Uprising, but definitely when I teach American students about the Warsaw Uprising, the Warsaw 44, the film itself, helps me really to give them the sense of the carnage, of the tragedy that really happened there. And if I may just continue on what you said about like what would make us Polish, what delineates Polish identity, I think I would go even farther back, at least to the 19th century. And when we think about the time when the national identities have been formed, and in the Polish context, immediately we think about Adam Mickiewicz, so it's like the biggest engineer of Polish identity. And thinking about what it would be, according to him or the people who really promoted his arts, I would identify a few characteristics that later on would nicely fit in with the Warsaw Uprising and other traumatic events in Polish history. So definitely it would be the celebration of sacrifice and victimhood. Not so much defiance. I think that came later on, the idea of a rebellious Pole. And I would also say that Catholicism, or the idea that Poland does play a greater role on a global scale, so messianism. So those four concepts, I think, really form like the strongest and the most appealing narrative about Polish national identity. And as you said, Jaroslaw, I think that it's really, it's dangerous to even think about that there is one main national identity, but I do think that there are certain narratives that are dominant, and that would be a dominant narrative. However, coming from somewhat younger generation, I would say also that there is a competing, more recent narrative that would try to reconfigure Polish identity. And that I'm thinking here about the research of Jan Sowa, who is really a brilliant Polish sociologist, who would see Poland not so much as a victim of very aggressive appetites coming from Soviet Union, Russia, Prussia, or later Germany, but more so who would see Poland as a victim of its geopolitical position. That's one, but more about very bad management. So Sowa basically says that Poland, together with other Central European countries, belong to the sphere, to the circle of countries that are państwa niewydarzone, which it's a very nice term because it really encompasses two meanings. Niewydarzone meaning that a little bit backward, not even to say retarded, but underdeveloped, but also a country that hasn't fully happened yet. And the premise for his argument is that because Poland is looking forward to the West and it tries to become like the Western democratic notion, nevertheless is split because spiritually, in the realm of spirit, temperament, etc., it does belong to more free-spirited East, meaning Russia, Ukraine, etc. And I think that.
So, Bozena, your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm listening to Paulina, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, I value Jan Sowa's assessment, and he certainly is from a young generation of scholars. And his assessment of this mismanagement of Poland as part of the Central European kind of experience or Central European misfortune, perhaps, is very, it's essential, and it kind of brings the old Polish question, and I don't know to what extent that plays a role in the identity. But Poles were always glorified, those who died for Poland, but they did not glorify those who worked and lived for Poland. And from the Polish American experience, I think such a hero is kind of exemplified in Jan Karski, who not only was a hero during World War II, he survived, and he was extremely successful Polish American. Was he glorified by the Polish American community? No, he lived. He, it's very interesting that he was not kind of revered and during his life. After his death, yes, there was, but he was better known in the Jewish American community than in the Polish American community.
Interesting. So growing up in upstate New York with my parents, had an education on Polish history, but clearly the dominant major impact on me was their World War II experience. And that's how I viewed myself through that prism, if you will, always. Only more recently, with the fall of the Iron Curtain? Was there something more modern that started squeaking into that sense of Polish identity? There's a question asked by one of our panelists saying that her mother believes that to claim Polish identity, you must have knowledge of the Polish language. Your thoughts on that, Jarek?
Gosh, I'm not sure there's a definitive answer on that. Yes, I suppose up to a point that is true, but I think certainly in the United States there are plenty, I think, of second generation Poles who consider themselves Polish but really don't speak Polish at all. I mean, you know, they all come up with the phrase "jak się masz," which incidentally I've never used in Polish ever. I don't use that when I meet my friends ever. So I'm not so sure you have to necessarily be a speaker. I mean, if you think you think there's a Polishness in you, I think that counts for a lot. I really think it does. It's a bit romantic and sentimental, but why not?
It's accurate. It's subjective. It's, are you Polish? Do you see yourself as somehow Polish? That's a subjective. To whether someone imposes a requirement of language speaking, that's an objective standard, which I don't buy into at all. But
yeah,
you know,
and I would agree with both of you, because even when we think about like Mickiewicz creating this idea of being a great advocate of what does it mean to be Polish and what is Poland, what not, he was never very much set on the language as being a criteria of somebody who really essentially feels Polish. It was more about the Polish soul, so to speak, the Polish spirit. So language is a great door through which you can explore and access additional levels of cultural world, etc., but it's not essential. I think what's essential is more the cultural codes that you are able to decipher because you have this certain kind of background, heritage, or education that really familiarized you with those codes. So it's more, I would be, romantic probably it's a good term. So I will be more romantic and more relaxed about language being the only or the most important key in delineating what makes us Polish.
Well, I'm glad that Jarek mentioned the Polish American community. The numbers show very, very clearly that the multi-generational Polish American community, or Polonia in the United States, is 99% non-Polish speaking.
That high?
Yes. Among immigrants, and I'm glad you're sitting, among immigrants, about 5% transfer the Polish language to their offsprings. Those are new arrivals, people who barely speak English sometimes. They want their children to integrate. They want their children to become mainstream Americans. There is a program in the United States in public school education that allows parents, as few as 15 parents in the Chicago area, don't know what it is in the other states, that allows to introduce a foreign language into primary or secondary school if 15 parents say, I want my child to learn Polish. Guess how many programs, Polish programs, are there? In a almost million strong Polish American community in Chicago and the suburbs? One.
Jeez.
So it's really puzzling, okay? And this cannot be a criteria. I know it would be wonderful if we could preserve that, because learning any foreign language, it's like living in two cultures, living in two worlds. I mean, the best test for people who are bilingual, truly bilingual and bicultural, you say the one word in English and the other word in Polish, for example, tree and drzewo, and they see a different plant. Okay, It is amazing, but the studies were done that people actually do see different plans depending on which language is used, which kind of leads us in the direction that their perception of the world doubles. In two different ways they see issues. They're much more open, much more, it enriches their lives. But unfortunately, this is not the case. The numbers show us that foreign languages in general are not appreciated in the United States. Europe cultivates foreign languages because of the proximity, because of the multinational European structures. And if you are raised in the Netherlands, you start with 5 languages in the elementary school. So, you're lucky. It used to be that way in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You spoke a different language to your parents, you spoke different language to your governess, you spoke different language to the servants, and so forth. So kids were growing up speaking 3-4 languages from affluent families. And oftentimes aristocracy did not speak Polish.
No.
Although they considered themselves Poles. So, there is this historical and, social economic issue, but in America, this becomes a completely different sense of, the role of a language. Americans are absolutely convinced that English is absolutely sufficient to survive, to do business in the world, they don't need to, it's a continental state, country. And they don't feel that they need to learn any other language, since English was basically accepted as the language of the world. And Poles wanting to be the mainstream Americans oftentimes adopt this approach. But that doesn't mean that they don't have Polish identity. I know Polish Americans who are 4th or 5th generation. As a matter of fact, my dear colleague from Loyola University, who helped start the Polish studies program here, Dr. Frank Kujawiński, his great grandparents came from Silesia. And he learned Polish going to Poznan to teach English in his 20s. He was the biggest promoter of Polish culture that I have encountered. So it does vary.
I'm a little disappointed in the statistics about Polish language. There have been a lot of comments from our listeners about Polish language and the role it plays in the Polish identity. What other aspects of our identity are prominent or more prominent? Would it be ancestry, family values, religion? Any thoughts?
Could I just chip in though, just follow up briefly all the previous conversation, having grown up in the UK but lived in the US for 30 years now, it seems to me that the pressures to acculturate and to integrate are much stronger in the US than they are in the UK. Partly for the reasons Bozena said, people think English is the only language that need to learn and all that, but I never encountered pressures in the UK, for instance, to change my name or anything like that. And those sort of pressures one does encounter, it seems to me, more in the United States, just piggybacking on what was said before. And there was certainly very little pressure, I think, on Poles in Britain after the war. You've got to be 100% British and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add a few words to that. I think, the statistics that Bozena told us about are devastating, it seems. However, I think there is a reversal trend lately that I see among younger American students. So definitely, since I started teaching Polish in the US, which was like over 10 years ago, in fact, the kids who had Polish heritage but could not speak almost anything in Polish had almost like a difficult relationship with their parents, because they felt that their parents didn't do a good job. So the younger generation really felt a little bit neglected. They did want to speak Polish. They didn't understand the reasons why their parents, who were many times economic immigrants, would like their children to adjust to become American. So not to have this all of this Polish background that is related with certain stereotypes, etc. Lately, I have to say that I have more and more students whose not both parents, but very often one parent is only Polish, who speak Polish at the advanced level and who take pride in it and who want to speak the language, because Poland is part of the EU. So having Polish, you can travel to Poland, you can explore the rest of Europe, etc. So it's like a doorway to European Union almost. So I see the positive trend here with the younger generation, and probably the changes that Poland is experiencing on the European scene, where there is not so much this inferiority complex that you should come to the US, forget your ancestry almost, and become American. Diversity is, I think, that matters more and more.
Well, Paulina, I think you touched on something very, very important. The 2004 joining the European Union changed a lot. And also the policies of the Polish government to bring back and give the citizenship to people whose ancestors come from Poland. That is a very wise policy, because it opens the door to the European Union and potentially to economic benefits from that come with it. So I also do see students who are interested in that and go to Poland and start their careers in Poland and so forth and so on. There's also another aspect. I mean, there's a large group of about 26,000 students of Polish language in the Polish Saturday school system, which is an alternative. I mentioned before the public school system, where you could have Polish language instructions 5 days a week and treat it as any other language, like Spanish and Russian, French, or Italian. This is different. This is more kind of parochial approach. It was started in the 50s by the post-World War II generations, when lots of educators came to the United States. And in the 50s, they organized the Polish Saturday schools for their kids. And those schools grew beautifully. And they are very strongly now supported by the Polish government, financially and otherwise, with different methodology and exchange, and also taking the students to Poland on trips, which changes their life and approach to studying Polish completely, because they often think of Saturday school as this punishment, instead of going and kicking the ball on Saturday or watching the TV or playing games on the computer. They have to go to Saturday school. But actually, those trips to Poland are very, very good way of motivating them. So there is a variety of things that are available, but many parents decide not to send their kids. And I also hear from students, oh, I wish my parents sent me to the Polish Saturday school, or I wish I didn't drop out in the 3rd grade because they didn't want to go, and so on and so forth. But there certainly is also the intermarriages, depending on the interest and the strength of dynamic in the family. Very often the kids learn Polish because only one parent represents that culture, and they are quite often very fluent. I had also had students who just had neighbors who were Polish, and they were non-Polish, and they were playing with the neighbors and learned the language. And when came to university, they started at the intermediate level. They were very, very functional in Polish because they played with their Polish neighbors. So there is a variety of things. But what changed dramatically is that Poland opened up. Since the 90s, there is an ease of traveling to Poland. And when Jarek was talking about not, a different atmosphere in Great Britain and greater interest in Polish language, it's the proximity of Poland. You can hop on the plane and 2.5 hours be anywhere in Poland, basically, right? Or in Kraków or Warsaw, or many other places from London and so forth.
Go by bus. You can go by bus. You don't even have to fly.
Exactly. Where it is a bigger excursion from New York, Los Angeles. Now Houston is becoming also a Polish. There are schools appearing in Houston, Polish Saturday schools. So it's much further, or from Seattle and even from Chicago. So it takes
they
time.
used to have buses that go from London to Rybnik, for instance, which is
There you go.
So a lot of our listeners agree with us on language, that it shouldn't be the beginning and end all of Polish identity. And a lot of the readers are also disappointed in the statistics about the language and how it's not being passed on. I was hoping, as I said earlier, that sort of died out 30, 40, 50 years ago, but I guess it's still prevalent, which is a shame.
But it's true for other immigrant groups as well.
Well, someone mentions
It's not
that.
a Polish phenomenon.
Plus, I think
One of our readers mentioned that they don't see this reticence to pass on language in other ethnic communities.
Exactly.
And they mentioned Spanish. They want to pass it on. So why are Poles different in that respect? But
as far as Spanish is concerned, it's a second language spoken in the United States with growing numbers, definitely growing numbers. And just in the proximity across the border, you have a whole Central and South America Spanish speaking and Portuguese. So, there is a rationale to be able to speak Spanish for many, many reasons. I mean, in parts of Arizona or Texas or Florida, you actually need to speak Spanish if you want to be able to communicate with your coworkers.
And also to explain the low number of Polish speakers, I think for everybody who had kids in a foreign country, they know that it's not easy to convince kids to speak a language that is not spoken by your playground pals, yes. Right? Yeah. And like encouraging them to go to Saturday school is like, oh no, I don't want to go to yet another school on Saturday. So it's also, we have to consider that it's not like kids are like sponges, they absorb a language, it's enough to listen to the language. No, I think it requires lots of work from both the parents and the kids, and really hard work to acquire the language. So so kids want to speak the language of their friends. If their friends speak English, they do speak English with them.
All right, I'd like to go on to other aspects of a Polish identity. Someone mentions that they're Kashuby, they're Kashub, and they see themselves as Polish. So in that person's mind, and I agree, ethnicity is not necessarily the determinator of whether you have a Polish sense of identity. Thoughts on that? Jarek?
Gosh. Well, I'm not sure I know the answer to that. There's a part of me that says, if we live in a democracy and if you feel you want to feel Polish, so be it. You feel Polish, whether you're Kashub or whatever other, what other background you are, even if you don't live in Poland. That will be my instinctive reaction. I don't know any Kashubs actually, so I don't know quite. Yeah, sorry, Paulina.
No, I think that it's like it's okay to have your smaller more local identity that falls within the umbrella of some kind of big identity, and that what makes, let's say, Polish identity so much more interesting, because within that Polish identity you have different fractions. Let's say Kashuby would be one of them, or people from Silesia, right? Szczepan Twardoch, one of the contemporary authors, is doing a great job of trying to reconstruct or bring attention of Polish Poles to local identities such as Silesians. So I think this doesn't, being Polish can mean being Kashubian, can mean being a Silesian. I think it's all okay as long as we do not try, let's say, as educators, as policymaker, we do not try to make one mainstream Polish narrative that if you are Polish, you are this or that. Yeah, I remember, I am from the countryside, so I remember how penalized we were if we used some kind of words that would belong to like more local jargon, which I didn't like it, because to me it seems like that's how my grandparents spoke, that's the word they would use, and from the teacher's perspective it was a mistake, language mistake, which I always had problems understanding, because I thought, like, why would that be a mistake? It's just like a different word in a different, almost in a different language. So I think as long as we are not trying to make something, Polish identity being something very universal, good. I think we should include all other local identities.
I mentioned that it's a subjective thing. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I was gonna say, if you think of the United Kingdom, I mean, you're much, very ultimately a small country compared to the United States, where you have huge regional variations within it. Obviously, Welshman, you never call a Welshman an Englishman. For heaven's sake, don't call a Scotsman an Englishman. And yet there is a sort of United Kingdom identity, which is fraying, admittedly, right now, partly to do with Scottish independence and partly to do with Brexit, which of course is actually splitting the UK apart. But I mean, folks in Yorkshire, for example, which is only 200 miles from London, feel themselves to be very, very different people from folks in the capital. And in Texas, I mean, Texans will tell you that Texas is a country, as it was, in fact, for what, 5 or 6 years back in the 19th century. But they all feel American too at the end of the day. So I think if a Kashub feels Polish, I mean, that's wonderful. I think the Poles should embrace the fact that people want to be Polish, not push them away. Bring them in, be delighted. That's a compliment.
Well, I would like to go back to something that Paulina mentioned, the regional dialects in Poland. Of course, in the United States, and you hear a lot of dialects of the Polish language, Kashubian being one of them. There is very limited way to preserve them in the United States. However, in Poland, they are being right now cultivated and preserved. And I do make an effort, for example, in my classes teaching Polish, especially advanced Polish, to show students the regions where different dialects are actually being taught, and Kashubian being one of them, and the alphabet song and the certain words in Kashubian. So we do that, and it is right now finally in Poland also cultivated. Since Poland joined the European Union, it is being monitored and it's being implemented. There's Lithuanian being taught, there's Kashubian being taught, Silesian, and so forth. So it's great. I'm really glad that it's happening in Poland. It is much more difficult here. However, the American linguists are extremely keen on promoting any foreign or heritage language, because there's a whole base of many heritage languages spoken at home, and they really do not want the language instructors to correct that. Whether it's grammatically incorrect, phonetically incorrect, doesn't matter. As long as they speak and as long as they communicate, let them do it, do not correct them. Well, there is a dilemma with Polish. As Paulina mentioned, there is a high level of criticism and purism in Poles how you use the Polish language. If you do not speak standard Polish, you are immediately given a label. and not treated as with as much with respect as you should be. And how do you permit your students who bring from Poland beautiful Podhalański dialect, from the mountains, and it's exactly from there, or Kashubian dialect, and you say no, you can't say that because you'll be and when I was a business consultant on language, I remember it's an anecdote, a student, the person that I was training, she was going to be a manager of BP in Poland. And she thought she spoke Polish. Well, she did. She spoke Podhalański. She spoke the mountaineers' Polish. And I said, listen, you are going to be a manager for the first year. Intensive Polish, standard Polish lessons, and pretend you don't speak Polish. Fortunately, she took my advice, and I received a letter from her that says, this was the best advice you could give me. Otherwise, I could not organize my coworkers or have me, they would treat me terribly. Thank you for being honest. So this is a problem. How do you approach that? I was born and raised in Warsaw, and there is a Warsaw dialect as well, by the way. Too many diminutives and too many and softening of certain K and G, but that's very typically Warsaw, and it's kind of dying out. And you can tell Warsawian by those characteristics. But if you misuse certain grammatical terms, you were basically ostracized by your Polish language teacher in high school or at the university level, no matter what, it didn't matter. They would let you know that this isn't proper and you don't raise to a certain level. And it's still going on. It is still going on.
I don't think it's just Polish. For instance, if for example, you were to meet a British ambassador to the United States who had a strong Yorkshire accent, talk like this, you'd be real surprised, wouldn't you? If you had a British ambassador talk like this, you would be really, really surprised. They may have an accent from Northern Ireland, possibly, or Scots even, but they wouldn't have a broad Yorkshire accent. It would be highly unusual. Now,
right.
Whether that's snobbery is another matter altogether, and I think
that's right. That's right.
The capital always thinks it's whatever capital thinks it's more important. There's less of that in the United States. I don't think Washington has quite the same aura, throughout the states, say that Paris has in France. If you live in France and you're not Parisian, well, gosh, you're not really French, are you? That kind of thing.
Well, I'm looking at the chat and I see a lot of concern.
There's some fascinating ones. Yeah, I'm just reading.
Yes, about concern about the language and all. I just wanted to put everybody, kind of at rest and not to worry. Polish is not outside of the norm. In the last 5 years, because the article that I'm quoting right now from the Chronicle of Higher Education appeared in January 2019. There was 651 language programs were cut from American universities. And Polish isn't even mentioned in this article because it's so-called lesser taught language. But just please listen to those statistics. French lost 129 programs. German lost 86 programs. Italian lost 56 programs. The only growing languages were sign language, biblical Hebrew, and Korean. Not even Spanish. So please put it in the context, and there is really no need to be very concerned. I mean, this is very typical in American culture, which promotes assimilation, promotes, the melting pot is theoretically over, but practically it's not. People still want to fit in, especially young people want to fit in, and they want to be American. However, I've noticed in the chat, yes, the Polish last names are not being changed. That is a huge change from the 70s. There are so many Polish last names in business, in journalism, in professions that before people did not want to anglicize their last name. They cut the endings, did all kinds of things, simplify them. Right now, it's not necessary. People feel it isn't necessary. So that's positive.
And I know of instances where someone changed their name back to the Polish spelling from a very short 4-letter name that the grandfather had adopted when he came over. So there is less pressure in that respect. But still, the language stuff is a little disappointing. So we talked about ethnicity not being determinative. What other aspects of Polish identity would be prominent? Would it be religion? Would it be family values? Paulina, any thoughts about that?
Both of them would be, I would say, and that again goes back to the 19th century, Catholicism, etc. Family values. That when you say that, what came to my mind is the idea of, if you were to break down the Polish identity into some like smaller elements, we would also have the model of like the Polish mother. And that would go back to the family values. So the idea of a Polish mother being the center of the family, in a sense that, you know, caring, loving, organizing family life is very strong. This is not to say that this idea of a Polish mother is like totally domesticated role of a housewife, because the idea of a Polish mother is also such that embraces the resourcefulness. So meaning that Polish women who were throughout the history had to stay home, take care of their houses, families when men went to war, had to really become strong family figures that ran the family during the hardships when men were at war or when men were away. So family values with the emphasis on the role of motherhood, I think that's something that would be very much still prominent in thinking and productive in thinking about Polish identity. Maybe about religion. Go ahead. And you, Marian, I think you mentioned also last time when we talked about the food, right? How celebration of food or of certain national, very diverse national dishes, not by no means limited to only to pierogi, would be also not so much about the food, but as about like gathering together, preparing food together, and spending time together while consuming different types of foods. I was shocked how I was invited to many vigilias in the United States, and I was totally shocked how I was treated with dishes that I could not even picture or imagine that they could have originated from the United States, from Poland, or the dishes that were very nicely adjusted to the American context. So I think the family values would be something strong, but I think it's something that is relevant in almost any identity, because family is more like a microcosm of a nation, so to speak. So it's so I think it would be important in any other national identity. For Americans, definitely, it is important.
I think it's absolutely true, but how the Poles do it, you know, those nuances, whether it's the cuisine, whether it's the 3-day weddings, whether it's midnight mass and the dinner before, I mean, all those things are very cultural centric, but that's part of the identity, I believe, also.
Yeah, and I would say also drinking habit and the idea of like you go out and drink and you don't do small talks, but you talk about like real serious existential issues.
Yeah.
That's something that I think would maybe set Poles apart when we talk about this like cuisine or culinary things. Yeah, no small talks. I think that's something that many Poles have problems with when they come to the United States, and why they would consider, let's say, Americans somewhat superficial, because they are not very well versed in small talk.
Well, that's certainly true of Poles in the UK. I mean, because Brits are actually very good at small talk. You go to parties and you're, as you know, Paulina, you spent time at UCL. And Poles are not good at that. They immediately have to start talking, you know, they're all like characters from a Dostoevsky novel, you know, and that just turns the Brits off. The Brits go like this, oh, please, no, we
Well, and another issue is, you know, Poland in the center of everything. You know, the Polish conversation kind of always come around something Polish. it has to kind of circle back, and you know, I'm guilty of doing that as well. My husband even has a saying that, you know, there's always a Polish connection in whatever it is being said. But yes, coming back to the traditions, I think you're absolutely right, Paulina, about a certain tradition, and Marian as well. In Chicago, for example, the Easter Święconka, the blessing of the basket, has become so popular that other ethnic groups picked it up. When I go, oh yes, Mexicans and Central Americans bring huge baskets, you know, with wine, with all kinds of, you know, exotic foods, and because they go to the same Catholic church as Poles. Some of the Polish original Catholic churches are right now in very Latin American neighborhoods. And if you want to go to Święty Stanisław Kostka or St. Cantius, which is very close to the center of the city, where the so-called Polish downtown used to be, but it was abandoned sort of by the Poles who moved to the suburbs, you will see various nationalities, predominantly Spanish-speaking, and they bring their baskets. I find it, and there are priests who speak Polish, English, and Spanish, blessing those baskets, which is lovely. So it is an interesting kind of interaction between different groups that become neighbors or take over, and it's certain areas in the city, and those traditions are very, very important. Another way of preserving Polishness, dancing groups. Chicago has half a dozen excellent Polish folk dance groups that are performing, that are very important for kind of cultivating Polishness among young people, because it's active, because it teaches them certain dances, but also texts to the songs and so on. You know, so they exist for generations. And there's, for example, lyra singers or ensemble, it was renamed several years ago, that is over 50 years old, and this group. And next to the recently published CD with Chopin's songs, they do also very beautiful renditions of folk songs. And it's a whole spectrum. So music and dances and harcerstwo, of course, the scouting. It's all very much part of the mosaic of Polish, preserving Polishness, at least in Chicago.
And so looking at the panel and listening to you, we have three categories of Polish here. We have Paulina, born in Poland, lives in Poland, Polish citizen, full out. You were born in Poland and came here and are part of Polonia. Jacek, born Brit, and me, just born American. So we have different perspectives. And between the three subcategories, what are the biggest differences, do you think? How Poles see themselves if you're born in Poland and continue to live in Poland, how Poles see themselves if you were born in Poland but now live in the States, and then Poles who were born abroad and continue to live abroad. Any major differences you detect in how they see each other?
Wow.
I'm sorry?
Well, if I could jump in here, there's a part of me that says those of us who grew up overseas, we're possibly less emotional about our Polishness, I think. I mean, I'm a bad example since, one of my parents wasn't Polish, although to be honest, she was very pro-Polish and spoke good Polish, but I think probably we're less emotionally, but I could be wrong. I don't know, Paulina and Bozena, what you grew up in Poland, right? I think we are slightly more detached. And I think, my generation of Poland, the UK, all just born just after the war, I think we're a little emotionally detached, makes it, we like to think we're more objective, if that's a way to put it. For instance, our parents, sorry, just our one final thought. Many of our parents, not mine particularly, but I know other friends' parents who still kept saying, well, we're going to go back to Poland and, and the decisions of World War II will all be overturned. And my generation knew that. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen right now anyway. We were much more pragmatic, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that for Poles who are born in Poland and who live in Poland, it seems like Poland is way more important on a global scale than it actually is. And that's something that I had to come to terms with when I came to the US, when I realized that it's not the case. Like, Poland may play an important role in certain events throughout the history, but it's not, the key player in world politics. And we have to stress other aspects of Poland, wonderful aspects that could attract foreigners to Polish culture, Polish language, etc. However, I may correct what Marian said about me, like being Poland, full-blown Polish, etc. I left Poland when I was 19. For the first time, I was like an economic immigrant. I went to Ireland, where I worked to, earn money for, I have also Irish connections.
Oh, I didn't know that. Now you tell me.
Oh my God. And so I had to, I did some very odd summer jobs to support myself when I went to university in Krakow. But then once I finished my BA, I moved to London when I again worked to save some money, and then I could enroll university. So I already am not sure, because it's been already 12 years since I've been moving from one place to another. I'm not so sure I am consider myself Polish, if there is such a thing. I am definitely Polish, but more Polish European. So somebody who really took advantage of the opportunities that Poland gained when we joined the EU. For me, it was really a deal breaker. And I did not feel myself, and many of my friends from my generation, we did not feel ourselves to be somebody who had to leave Poland because the situation back home was so bad, but because we wanted to take opportunities to do and to advance in other ways, or to see different places, etc. So I think for people who are listening to our talk, who probably have similar experiences as being at one point split between different places, the matter of identity, it becomes more and more blurry.
I think though
more
this
complicated.
Paulina, you mentioned though, Paulina, that you thought when you were in Poland, sort of Poland played a larger role than in fact it does. And I think I may have mentioned to this group the other day when I was in Warsaw some years ago, there was a wieczór autorski, wieczór literacki, and somebody asked me, no pan Stanak mieszka, co o nas tam mówią? No wie pani nic, you know, and she was absolutely stunned. Yep. What do you mean they're not talking about it? Well, they're not. You know, they're just not. But I mean, these things are cyclical. Everybody was talking about Australia last week because of Djokovic. Nobody's talking about Australia this week. I mean, it moves that fast. You know, these are fast-moving targets. But my experience is that many polls are very unrealistic polls in Poland about where Poland fits in the scheme of things. And it's, you know, one doesn't want to disabuse them and sort of, you know, be unkind, but they're not massively significant on the world stage. And I think some of them really find that incomprehensible. Am I overstating the case?
No, I think you're totally right. And even when I do research, it's always like, let's say I read a film magazines, it's always like, oh, in France, this critic said this about this Polish film. It's always like validating that whether the particular film is good or not, because a critic from, let's say, Sight and Sound said something exactly. So we always feel the need of like backing or highlighting our significance or accomplishments based on somebody else's opinion. We are very sensitive to that, I would say.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I just wanted to go back to the certain, you know, way of thinking of Marian's original question. I spent 2/3 of my life in the United States. I came to United States during my sophomore year in college. And I must say that from the time I arrived, when I consider myself, you know, kind of 100%, you know, Polish, I can only stay in this country if I can preserve this and do something that has to do with Poland and so forth, which it happens that I was able to do. But living here and missing a lot of stages of transformation in Poland and observing them from the United States. So having a very different perspective on what was going on in Poland and how it was perceived by Americans, or not perceived, or completely not noticed. Like Jarek said, they don't talk about Poles that much. They talked about it when Pope was elected. They talked about us when the Solidarity movement was alive, well, and then martial law was declared. We were on the news. There was, you know, interviews and everything was very, very important. But then things quieted down. And now Poland is, yes, somewhere there in Europe. Most of our students have difficult time locating Poland in Europe. And that's the reality. People don't think about Poland or Poles in America other than Poles themselves, and or Polish Americans. Why? Because the life is so fast, first of all. And secondly, there's so much information coming at us. And there's so many issues. And, you know, it's just, that's how things are. But it is very, very important. And actually, Norman Davies and others wrote about this in the magazine that used to be published in Chicago called To Be. The myths, Polish myths. And one of the myths was that Poles believed they were kind of center of other people's and other nations' attentions. And often do not realize how their neighbors, the Russians and the Germans, and now the Americans or the British are thinking about them, how, what opinions they have or how little they care. Which is, of course, difficult to deal with, but it is something that can give us a challenge and that can mobilize us to tell them more about us.
So Bozena, is that lack of knowledge, or is there bad press about us or fake news about Poland and Polish Americans or anyone with a Polish identity?
I don't think so. I don't think there's fake news about Poland, and I don't think there's bad press. I have never, in my long time living in the United States, heard as many Polish-sounding names in the media. I mean, starting from Nagórski in Newsweek for many, many, many years, to Mika Brzeziński and Joe Palka on NPR. And on NPR alone, there's half a dozen Polish-sounding last names. And NPR basically addresses people who, the opinion makers, the people who are, very, very au courant with the worldly things and are interested in things in society, in politics, international, and so forth. So there are lots of Polish names, and there's lots of interviews. BBC, which is being aired on local public station here, often talks about Poland and interviews people from Poland. Whenever there's something going on, if there's good news, they report, very, very good news. In 2008, for good 8 years, there was news that Poland is an economic powerhouse. We talked about The Economist, the very highly respected the weekly, British weekly, talked about Poland being an example of transition from the centralized economy to the market economy, and how well Poles did. What a great job they have done. So, of course, when there are bad things happening and laws are being broken, yes, there is criticism. When there are demonstrations and people are being killed, yes, there's press is reporting, but I don't think it's a bad press. It's just press doing their job, hopefully.
So let me put a point on this.
Worse. Yeah, I don't think the Poles are treated worse than others myself.
Okay, that was my question.
That's my thought. I mean, if you think how the French were dumped on when the French didn't support the Americans in the Iraq War, I mean, the amount of anti-French abuse. I mean, there's nothing like that. The Poles have never encountered anything like that in the United States at all. And I know some Poles have sort of, been upset by being called Polacks. Well, I mean, that's no worse than Brits being called Limeys and Germans being called Krauts and Irish being called Paddies. I mean, it's just, I don't think we should spend too much time worrying over those things myself. I've certainly never suffered from that. I'm just fascinated by some of these comments that people are writing, though. But Marian, you're seeing these too. So.
No, but please address them if you have anything you want to particularly mention. To sort of take that point, do any of you feel that Poles are discriminated against, or at least singled out compared to other ethnic groups? And then any of your experiences?
Well, what I would say in the UK, growing up in the 1950s and 1960s, you knew there were certain areas that that you would not be able to work in. For example, the armed forces and diplomacy would be one, and that was quite simply because of security concerns. If you had family behind the Iron Curtain, you were obviously possibly vulnerable to blackmail, and you would have been. And there have been cases of one or two people who did change their names. There is a politician, a Labour politician called Dennis McShane, who was a junior minister in the Labour government. I was at school with him actually, but he wasn't called Dennis McShane then. He was Dennis Matyjaszek, and he took his mother's name because he went into the trade union movement, and it was made pretty clear to him that he could only get so far with a name like that. And I have known a couple of people in the British Army who got to a certain rank and they were told that, but that's changed. This is all 20, 30 years ago. Today, no, it's not true at all, in the UK at any rate.
Bozena, your thoughts as part of Polonia, American Polonia?
Well, I see some of the comments. Yes, there was time when there was proliferation of so-called Polish jokes, which were just kind of rehashed Irish jokes or rehashed Italian jokes. You know, just the adjective Italian or Irish was changed into Polish, and you know, it made whoever was the protagonist, so to speak, of the joke was called stupid or dumb or whatever. But I think that period has passed. I think here again, the election of John Paul II was definitely the turning point. And then this incredible movement of 10 million people, solidarity movement, you know, showed the whole world who was, you know, really watching very, very carefully what was happening, and that all this stereotypes that might have been created to kind of show that Poles are the latest arrivals, or perhaps nobody has a chance to defend them. Remember, there were in general anti-Catholic jokes in the United States, you know, until Kennedy was elected. I mean, this was kind of Catholics, mistrust and so forth. It changed. It changed in the 80s. It changed from that point on. And with the new professional immigration of professional Poles immigration to the United States, I think this is changing rapidly. I mean, all the not all, but many competitions for specialists in technology, the latest technology, are being won by great and you know, really genius young people in electronics and cyber science and so forth. And they are being immediately taken by major companies. They compete for them. And in other areas, I mean, it is really very encouraging to see how many people come to Chicago because of the career opportunities being transferred from Polish cities, you know, to work for several years in the United States. Some of them stay, some of them go back. It's this kind of global economy that brought a lot of Polish professionals. And that, of course, changed the stereotype that might have existed dramatically.
Yeah, and I think it's, again, the fact that Poland joined EU, it did change the makeup of Polish immigration globally. So simply stated, it was not worth it to fly all the way through the ocean to the United States to become an, you know, economic immigrant, when you could go to England, which was so much closer, so much easier and cheaper, at least back in the day, not so much anymore. And I have to say that my experience of meeting Polish immigrants in the United States have been in line with what Bozena said, that they were fully skilled, educated professionals who came to the United States to advance their careers or use their skills rather than just to support themselves economically. That fraction of people, I think, big bulk of these people would go to Great Britain, Ireland, etc.
So a lot of the comments talk about personal experiences dealing with discrimination. And as I mentioned in one of our meetings, I grew up in an environment where I didn't feel that, but it's very subjective, you know, the luck of the draw, so to speak. But I do think what has changed also is the perception of Poland in American eyes. You know, now we've had solidarity, we've had John Paul II, we've had the falling of the Iron Curtain, the Polish economy boom, NATO. All of a sudden, Poland, if it exists positively in the press for the most part, and the athletes and all that stuff. So whereas for years, for decades, it was just part of this dark part called behind the Iron Curtain, you know. So that changes people's perception of everybody. So that's a factor. I'd like to tie this into Polish studies. So we have a fair amount of expertise on this panel on the topic of Polish studies. So I'd like to talk about how what we've discussed to date plays into the teaching of Polish language, literature, culture. And we've touched this before. I mean, languages, there's less of them being taught. Is there something that can be done about that? And who would like to start? I know Bozena.
Bozena is probably, yeah.
Thank you. I think demand. I know that when there are students who are interested in certain topics and petition or express their willingness and interest in studying them, the universities will comply simply because they treat students as their clients. Polish was brought to Loyola because every 10th student at Loyola is of Polish ancestry. There were numbers, and there was a post-solidarity movement, generation of kids, parents who came after the solidarity was crushed, and their kids were very, very patriotic and very, very strongly intentioned on studying Polish at the university level. They petitioned the president, they did the fundraiser, and they created a program. So that kind of support, the community support, I think in Seattle, it's extremely strong. And Seattle, because there's lots of professional in the cyber sciences in that area, quite affluent. They support the Polish studies at the Washington University in Seattle, and there are very strong Polish studies there. So it really has to be very systematic and very focused effort to create a program or to preserve a program. We mentioned University of Florida, which is struggling with maintaining the Polish program. And there's lots of Poles in Florida. If they could support that, if they could fundraise, if they could, petition, and their kids would petition, the program would certainly be stronger and there would be much more offering. And coming back to the Polishness and cultivating Polishness, it's not only the language. We offer 10 courses in Polish literature, history, film, and political science. I know it's a limited areas. We are trying to develop more arts and music and sociology and so forth. That's our ambition. But right now we have those courses available. And if students go and enlist in those courses, take them, I think they learn so much. And many of our students who take those courses are not of Polish ancestry. They are simply curious about Poland. They had Polish neighbors, they had Polish classmates, they had Polish significant others, and they study and learn, and they become Polish ambassadors, which is absolutely priceless.
Yeah, I think that community lobbying and organizing is key, and it's very important, but I think there also has to be an institutional support coming from university administration that would support the Polish programs. And usually they're underfunded. Slavic departments are not functioning very well around the United States. Of course, Russian is always the strongest component, so I think they are not threatened, but less commonly taught languages such as Polish, there would be. So I think also stressing the importance of giving the educators, lecturers, like really secure contracts is also another thing. Contracts that may not necessarily depend on like, you need to have at least 10 students enrolled, otherwise you will lose this job, right? Which is lots of, it puts lots of pressure on the teachers themselves. And I have to say that like in all three places that I worked in the United States, so University of Michigan, Duke University, and now Brown, it's always about this one or two people who are dedicated to really trying to push forward the agenda about Polish program, who try to organize events, who try to bring speakers from Poland to popularize Polish studies in the United States. But it's not easy. It's not easy because if there is a lack of security when it comes to jobs, so people who are supposed to promote Polish culture, then I think this is like the core of the issue, because I think interest will be there, of course, way more so in Chicago area or Midwest than, let's say, North Carolina. When I was at Duke, it was just like a handful of people who would be interested, but it's doable. But there has to be a recognition of people who really do the job, because it's not, I think for people who do, I'm not praising myself, I'm more praising people like Bozena. It's not only about teaching, it's also about really finding the students who want to take Polish, which takes time, organizing internships or language studies, summer abroad in Poland, organizing events, making placement tests. It's not about teaching at all. It's just basically like one person orchestra sometimes in those departments.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And you're absolutely right about Slavic department, that competing with Russian is very difficult and not always possible. But fortunately, in some schools, there are modern language departments when there is a much broader spectrum of languages, and it's much easier to survive. To give an example, Loyola has that kind of a structure, and Russian is much less popular, although it could have been, but there is no community support. Therefore, there's one course in Russian, and we have 18 per semester. So that's a huge difference. So I think it is very important to remember that engagement and involvement of the community leaders and individuals who can afford certain generosity towards educational institution to organize something like that. I mean, $10 million that was given by Mr. Hejna and his family to University of Illinois secured the Polish studies program at University of Illinois for forever, basically, because it's an endowment that will keep on giving.
Yeah, and the same is the case about the Polish Center of Polish Studies, Copernicus Center of Polish Studies in University of Michigan.
Right.
Yeah, that's like a big endowment, and thanks
exactly.
to
and that's the key, because there are endowments everywhere for other areas. There is for German, there is for Italian. Just Italian chair was created for $1 million at our university that specializes in Italian American history. So they have Italian history or Italian literature and history, and this is Italian American literature and history. And it was created by endowment just 2 years ago. So it is possible, and it can be either Poland and Polish Americans. I think there's so much to be said about the Polish American history, and there's so much interest in it in Poland, because Polish scholars come here and study those documents that were gathering dust for decades. Now they're really writing incredibly interesting books and papers on them, but just telling Americans how important the Polish community was in building the city, in the whole process of urbanization, the process of a certain integration of different ethnic groups in different regions. It is really fascinating.
So I have a question. Do any of the mother countries support these study programs at universities? Like the Italian government, the Polish government supporting studies in Italian and Polish at various American universities. Does that happen?
I would guess that they do. I know the Polish government is supporting such efforts. Columbia University is a good example in New York, where there was a very focused fundraising and led by prominent officials from Polish government in the about 2011, 2010, 2015, and it actually created endowed chair at the Columbia University. There are smaller grants given by the Polish government to do certain programming at various universities, which is very important. And I'm certain that the other governments support it too. But the most important is various ethnic groups.
Yeah, I believe the Japanese government, doesn't it support sort of Saturday schools for Japanese?
Oh yes, I'm sure they do. Yeah, I'm sure they do. I know that the Hebrew and Jewish studies are heavily supported, but predominantly by Jewish Americans. And they are at basically every other university.
So we're winding down. Have any of the panelists seen any comments or questions they want to particularly address or speak to?
Gosh, there's some lovely comments, all sorts of.
There are. There
Yeah.
absolutely are.
I'm glad we can all read these. Yeah. Yeah. Bush started talking about freedom fries instead of French fries. French fries. That did happen actually. I think the Germans support their schools, don't they? I think, but you know, the
Yes,
Goethe
through the Goethe Institute. Yes, they certainly do. Well, the Spaniards have the
Cervantes Institute.
Cervantes Institute, right? Alliance Française, that's French, and of course the Goethe Institute, and they are very engaged in promoting culture and different programming, language teaching as well. Apart from the university, they propose their own courses. So I think that's very important. And I think Polish government in the early 2000s made an effort to create the Polish Cultural Institute in New York, but it was only limited to New York, and unfortunately never came to Chicago, never came to other important Polish town and regions in the United States, which limits its effectiveness. That's why it's basically to the Polish American organizations such as the Kosciuszko Foundation, the Polish American Medical Association, all the professional groups that are well endowed and pretty affluent to support such programs, and of course individuals who are generous, because it's very crucial to have this kind of effort at the university level to educate the young Americans and Polish Americans. And another thing, we were trying to talk about the influencers, also enlisting people who can talk about Polishness and Polish culture and Polish presence in America. I think that is extremely important to enlist them and to cultivate contacts with them and kind of ask them to represent the cause of propagating Polish culture.
Did one of you mention the other day that Oprah Winfrey on one of her books for this year is?
Yes, I read that recently, that in the selection of the best books for 2022, the 50 recommended books. In the position number 15 is Tokarczuk's The Books of Jacob.
Interesting.
The most recent translation from
Not
Polish.
not an easy read.
Not an easy read. It's a challenge. It's a
I
challenge.
will start. So one of the comments says that no one's mentioned of Kosciuszko Foundation and its role. And for those that don't know, the foundation has been active from the very beginning of its very beginning in promoting Polish culture, Polish language. And then I encourage all our listeners, if you don't help support the Kosciuszko Foundation, to do exactly that. All right, so if we'll just.
Well said. Well said. Yes.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I'd like to announce the next webinar in the series will be The Crisis of Democracy in Interwar Poland, the obstacles to the establishment of a democratic and pluralistic Polish state. It's a lecture by Professor Antoni Polonsky, and it's going to take place on Thursday, February 17th, 2022. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
All right, so
Bye-bye.
Thank
we're
you very much.
goodbye all.
Thank you.
Goodbye,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Thank you so much.